16 million Americans served in the Second World War. When they came home to the most generous piece of legislation in American history. Free college, zero-down home loans, money to start a business, a year of income while they figured out what came next. It built the suburbs. It built the modern middle class. It is, without much argument, the single best investment the United States government has ever made in its own people. It almost didn't happen. It came within one vote of dying in a committee room. And the only reason it exists at all is that a lawyer from Kansas sat down in a hotel room in Washington and scribbled the whole thing out in longhand on hotel stationery over a couple of nights. But here's the part nobody tells you on Veterans Day. Before 1944, there was nothing. No GI Bill, no education benefit, no home loan program, no job placement. When the boys came home from the First World War, the war that was supposed to end all wars, the United States government handed each of them $60 and a train ticket. That was it. That was the thank you. And 14 years later, when those same men walked to Washington to ask for money they had already been promised, the United States Army rolled tanks at them, their own army, commanded by men whose names you learned in school. So how does a country go from burning its veterans out of their own camps to writing them the largest check in its history? The answer involves a cavalry charge down Pennsylvania Avenue, a segregationist congressman from Mississippi, a state trooper hunting a man through rural Georgia in the middle of the night, and a vote cast at 6:37 in the morning. And the answer to who actually got that money is darker than the version anyone tells at the parade. Let's go back further than you'd expect, because the idea that a nation owes something to the people who fought for it is much newer and much shakier than it feels. Start at the beginning. The Continental Army was paid in a currency that became a punchline. Not worth a continental was a real expression because the money genuinely wasn't. Soldiers were promised back pay and land warrants in territory that hadn't been surveyed yet, and many of them sold those warrants for pennies to speculators because pennies were what they had. By 1783, with the war effectively won, officers camped at Newburgh, New York, were so far past unpaid that a circular went around the camp suggesting the Army march on Congress and take what it was owed. George Washington walked into that room personally to stop it. He pulled out a pair of reading glasses, said he had grown gray in their service and now found himself going blind, and the room reportedly wept and the crisis dissolved. Sit with that for a second. The first American Veterans Benefits crisis happened before the Constitution existed. It was diffused not by policy, but by one man's personal credibility. That's the foundation this whole thing is built on. For the next century, the pattern held, and the pattern was narrow. Benefits were for the disabled and the widowed. If you came home with both arms and no visible wounds, the country's position was that you'd already been paid in wages, in glory, in the satisfaction of duty. There was no concept of a benefit for simply having served. The Civil War broke that mold, briefly and enormously. Union pensions expanded through the 1870s and 1880s until by the 1890s veterans' pensions were consuming something close to 40% of the entire federal budget. 40%. It was the largest social welfare program in the world at the time. But read the fine print because it's the whole story in miniature. Union only. Confederate veterans received nothing from the federal government. They were left to underfunded state programs, some of which didn't start paying until the men were in their 70s. The lesson wasn't that America takes care of its veterans. The lesson was that America takes care of the veterans. It decides, it owes. That distinction is going to come back. Which brings us to 1917. 4.7 million Americans served in the First World War. The war ended in November 1918, and the demobilization was less a policy than a stampede. The Army wanted these men off the payroll fast, and it got them off the payroll fast. What each man received on discharge was a $60 allowance and transportation to the place he'd enlisted. That was the entire package. There was no education benefit. There was no loan program. There was no job placement service. For the men who came home gassed or deaf or shaking in a way nobody had a word for yet, there was a medical system so improvised that veterans' hospitals were being run out of converted hotels and prisons. And here's what makes it worse. They came home into a wall. The economy that had been running white-hot on war production shut off. There was a sharp, ugly recession in 1920 and 1921. Their old jobs were filled. The women and the men who'd stayed had built lives in the space they left behind. Picture it. You're 23 years old, standing on a platform in a wool uniform that still smells like the ship. You've got $60 folded in your breast pocket, which is real money, about 4 weeks of a factory wage. There's no band. Your town had its parade 3 months ago for somebody else's regiment, and everyone's moved on. Your father's farm has been running fine without you, which is its own particular kind of insult. And in about 6 weeks, the $60 is going to be gone, and you're going to be standing outside a plant gate with 200 other men holding the same discharge papers. $60 was enough for a few months. It was not enough for a life. And the men who took it had no idea that in 12 years they'd come back to ask for the rest, and that the answer would arrive with bayonets on it. They organized. That's the thing about a generation that has just been taught to organize. The American Legion was founded in 1919 in Paris by officers of the American Expeditionary Force, who understood immediately that the men coming home were going to need a lobby. Remember that organization. It's going to run this entire story in 25 years. Through the early 1920s, the argument they made was simple and hard to refute. Civilians had spent the war years earning inflated wartime wages in defense plants. Soldiers had earned about $1 a day and the chance to be killed. The gap between those two numbers wasn't gratitude, it was arithmetic, and the veterans wanted the arithmetic settled. They called it adjusted compensation. The press called it the bonus, which was a terrible name because it made repayment sound like a gift. Congress passed it in 1924. President Calvin Coolidge vetoed it on the grounds that patriotism should not be purchased. Congress overrode him. So the World War Adjusted Compensation Act became law over a president's objection, which tells you exactly how much political appetite there was for paying these men. And then came the catch, and the catch was everything. The money was not paid. Each veteran received a certificate, roughly $1.25 for every day served overseas, $1 for every day served at home, plus compound interest. Payable in full in 1945, 21 years out. Read that again. A man who had been gassed at Belleau Wood in 1918 was handed a piece of paper in 1925 that said the United States would settle up with him when he was 50. It wasn't money. It was an IOU with a date printed on it, which was fine, comfortable even, right up until October of 1929. The Depression turned that certificate into the cruelest object in America. Veterans were hit disproportionately hard. They skewed toward the industrial and unskilled workforce that got flattened first, and every one of them was sitting on a piece of paper that represented real, legally owed money that they could not touch while their children were hungry. The demand became one sentence long: pay it now. In the spring of 1932, an unemployed cannery worker in Portland, Oregon named Walter Waters, a former Army sergeant, started walking. He and a couple hundred men hopped freight trains east. It grew at every stop. By the time it reached Washington, it had become a movement, and it had given itself a name that was a deliberate, pointed echo of the American Expeditionary Force they'd served in. They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, the Bonus Army. Somewhere between 17 and 20,000 veterans reached Washington that summer, and thousands brought wives and children with them. They built a shanty town on the Anacostia Flats, on mud flats across the river, in sight of the Capitol Dome. They built it out of packing crates, scrap lumber, and rusted car bodies. And here's the detail that should stop you cold. They ran it like a camp. They laid out streets. They dug latrines. They held roll call. They saluted. They published their own newspaper. They demanded discharge papers as proof of service to get in, and they threw out anyone they suspected was a communist agitator because they knew, they absolutely knew, that the first thing anyone would say about them was that they weren't really veterans. They were, overwhelmingly, exactly what they claimed to be. Disciplined men, camped in mud, asking for money the law already said was theirs, just earlier than the law said they could have it. The House passed the early payment bill. In June, the Senate killed it. A lot of men went home. Thousands stayed because they had nowhere better. Then July 28, 1932. District police moved to clear veterans out of a partially demolished building downtown. It turned into a scuffle, then a riot, then gunfire. 2 veterans were shot and killed by police, William Hushka and Eric Carlson. Hushka was a Lithuanian immigrant, a butcher, who had sold his shop in Chicago to enlist in 1917. President Hoover ordered the army to clear the city. General Douglas MacArthur took personal command. Major George Patton led the cavalry. Major Dwight Eisenhower was on MacArthur's staff and, by his own later account, told him this was a mistake and that a general of his rank should not be anywhere near it. Infantry advanced down Pennsylvania Avenue with fixed bayonets and tear gas. Cavalry rode into unarmed men. 6 tanks came up the street behind them. Federal troops drove American veterans out of the American Capitol while government clerks stood on the sidewalks and watched. And MacArthur didn't stop. His orders were to clear the downtown. He crossed the bridge into Anacostia anyway and cleared the camp. That night the shantytown burned, and photographers got the shot that ran in every newspaper in the country, a column of black smoke rising off the flats with the dome of the United States Capitol sitting in the frame behind it. The political consequence was immediate and total. Hoover was already going to lose in November. After Anacostia, he was going to lose the way he did, in a landslide, with his name turned into a synonym for indifference. When a smaller group of marchers returned in 1933, Franklin Roosevelt handled it differently. He sent them a field kitchen, sent them coffee, and sent Eleanor, who walked through the camp in the mud and led them in singing songs from the war. One veteran's line about it became famous. Hoover sent the army, Roosevelt sent his wife. Roosevelt still opposed early payment, and he vetoed it too. In 1936, Congress overrode him, and the bonus was paid 9 years ahead of schedule. But the lesson that Washington actually absorbed from Anacostia was not, "we owe these men more." It was something colder and far more practical. 16 million Americans were about to come home from a much bigger war, and every person in a position of power had personally watched what happens when you tell that many trained men to wait. By 1943, the outcome of the Second World War was no longer seriously in doubt in Washington, which meant the conversation quietly shifted to the thing that terrified them more than the war itself, the day after it. There were two fears, and they stacked on top of each other. The first was economic. The American economy of 1944 was a war economy. Roughly 40% of output was war production, and all of it was going to stop, more or less at once. At the same moment, 16 million people were going to be released from the armed forces and start looking for work. Serious economists inside the administration were forecasting unemployment in the millions within a year of victory. Not a recession, a second Great Depression arriving immediately, and this time with the entire generation that had just won the war standing in the middle of it. The second fear was political, and nobody said it out loud in a press conference. Anacostia was 12 years ago. Everyone in that building remembered it. Every senator, every congressman, every general. They had seen 20,000 betrayed veterans camped within sight of the Capitol, and that was after a war with fewer than 5 million Americans in uniform. Now imagine that number multiplied by 3, coming home to no jobs, and this time they'd fought a war of national survival and knew exactly what the country owed them. So let me say this plainly, because it's the part that gets sanded off in the tribute videos. The GI Bill was not a thank you note. It was a pressure valve. The education benefit didn't only educate people. It took millions of job seekers out of the labor market for 4 years and paid them to be somewhere else. That wasn't an accident of the design. That was the design. The unemployment provision wasn't only compassion. It was a floor under consumer demand during the most dangerous economic transition in the country's history. And here's the thing worth holding both of at once. The motive can be self-interested, and the outcome can still be one of the noblest things a government has ever done. Both are true. The GI Bill worked spectacularly. It also happened because Washington was scared. The question by late 1943 was not whether to do something, it was what. And the honest answer is that with less than a year to go, nobody had actually written it down. There were competing sketches. Roosevelt's own advisors wanted something targeted and means-tested, help for the veterans who demonstrably needed it. Others wanted a narrow education program and nothing more. The plans contradicted each other, and none of them had the votes. So the American Legion took the pen. In late December 1943 and early January 1944, a Topeka lawyer named Harry W. Colmery checked into the Mayflower Hotel in Washington. Colmery had been a flight instructor in the First World War, had served as national commander of the American Legion, and had chaired the Republican National Committee. He was, in other words, a man who knew exactly how a bill gets killed and exactly what a veteran wanted. He sat down alone in that hotel room with a pencil and a stack of hotel stationery, and he wrote the first draft of the GI Bill in longhand. No committee, no agency, no drafting staff. A man in a hotel room, writing on the hotel's own letterhead, some of which survives today. And what he did on those pages was the structural masterstroke of the entire story. Colmery didn't write one benefit, he wrote a bundle, education and training, with tuition paid directly to the school and a living stipend on top, federally guaranteed home loans with no down payment, guaranteed loans to start a business or buy a farm, unemployment pay of $20 a week for up to 52 weeks, a national job placement service, expanded veterans hospitals. That bundling is the reason it survived. The universities wanted the tuition. The banks wanted the guaranteed mortgages, because a federal guarantee makes a risky loan risk-free. The home builders wanted the buyers. The labor unions wanted the men kept out of the job market. The conservatives could call it earned, not welfare. Colmery had built something that gave nearly every faction in Congress a reason to say yes. Then the Legion did one more thing, and it was pure marketing. Their publicist, a former wire service reporter named Jack Saynar, needed a name that would fit in a headline. He called it the GI Bill of Rights. Not a benefit, not a program, a right. Try voting against that in an election year with the entire country's sons overseas. In March of 1944, the bill passed the Senate. Unanimously. Then it passed the House. Unanimously. And then it went to a conference committee to reconcile the two versions, and it stopped dead. The obstacle was a congressman from Mississippi named John Rankin. Rankin chaired the House Committee on World War Veterans Legislation, and he was an open, unembarrassed white supremacist, a man who used slurs on the floor of the House as a matter of routine. His objection focused on Title V, the unemployment provision, $20 a week for up to 52 weeks, which veterans would later nickname the 5220 Club. Rankin's stated concern, which he did not bother to disguise, was that in his part of the country, $20 a week from the federal government was more than a black veteran could earn picking cotton or working in a white household, and that if the federal government paid it, that labor supply would evaporate. So he fought to strip the provision, and when he couldn't strip it, he fought to make sure the money was administered locally, by state employment offices, by county officials, by the people already running the system he was trying to protect. Hold on to that, because it's the hinge the entire second half of this story turns on. The conference committee deadlocked, 3-3. The seventh member was Representative John Gibson of Georgia. Gibson was a yes vote. Gibson was also at home in Douglas, Georgia, 400 miles away, and nobody could find him. What happened next sounds invented. The American Legion got radio stations across Georgia to broadcast appeals for anyone who knew where Gibson was. Newspapers ran it. Georgia state troopers went out looking for him. He was located late at night, driven at speed to the airfield at Jacksonville, Florida, and put on a plane to Washington. He walked into that committee room at 6:37 in the morning on June 10, 1944, and broke the tie. 12 days later, on June 22, 1944, 16 days after the landings at Normandy, Franklin Roosevelt signed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act into law. What Culmery had written on that hotel notepaper was a door out of the working class and into something this country had barely had before, a genuine mass middle class. Congress built the door. But at Rankin's insistence, Congress did not hand out the keys. It let the states and the local offices and the local banks do that. In a country that was, in 1944, legally segregated. First, the scale D, because it deserves the number. By 1956, when the original program wound down, roughly 7.8 million of the 16 million eligible veterans had used the education and training benefits. About 2.2 million went to college. Another 5.6 million went into vocational programs, apprenticeships, and on-the-job training. In 1947, veterans made up close to half of all college enrollment in the United States. Half. Campuses that had been finishing schools for the sons of the wealthy threw up Quonset huts and trailer parks on the Quad and became mass institutions in the space of 4 years. The American Research University as we know it was substantially built by that wave. On housing, the Veterans Administration guaranteed mortgages with no down payment and below market interest. By 1955, around 2.4 million homes had been financed under it. National home ownership went from about 44% in 1940 to 62% by 1960. In 1947, William Levitt started mass-producing houses on Long Island, 27 a day at peak, and Levittown became the template for American suburbia. Remember that name. It comes back in about 3 minutes. The whole thing cost roughly $14.5 billion through 1956. A congressional study in 1988 estimated the return at close to $7 for every dollar spent in federal taxes alone, purely from the higher lifetime earnings of the men who used it. It is, on the numbers, the most profitable thing the United States government has ever done. 14 future Nobel laureates went to school on it, 3 future Supreme Court justices, something like a dozen senators, and beneath them, millions of engineers, machinists, doctors, accountants, and teachers who, in any previous generation of American history, would have gone straight from the discharge line to the same factory their father worked in. Every one of those numbers is real, and every one of them carries the same asterisk. Because a door is only as good as who holds the key. And in 1944, at the specific insistence of a congressman from Mississippi, the keys were handed to local officials, local banks, and local admissions boards. The education door first. About 1.2 million black veterans were eligible for the GI Bill. The benefit was theirs by law. The statute is race-neutral on its face, but the statute didn't build a single classroom. In the South, public universities were segregated by law. A black veteran could not enroll, benefit in hand or not. Across much of the North, universities held informal quotas or simply rejected the applications. That left the historically black colleges and universities, which were willing and which were already at capacity and chronically underfunded. In 1946 alone, an estimated 20,000 black veterans were turned away from HBCUs purely because there was no physical room, and the federal money to expand that capacity did not arrive. The benefit existed, the seat did not. The housing door second, and this is the one with the longest shadow. The VA guaranteed loans. It did not issue them. Local banks issued them, and local banks decided who qualified. Layered on top of that were the federal appraisal maps that had graded black and mixed neighborhoods as hazardous and uninsurable, which meant that even an approved buyer often couldn't buy where he could afford to. Layered on top of that were racial covenants written directly into the deeds of the new subdivisions. Levittown's original contracts explicitly barred resale to anyone not Caucasian. Here is the number that captures it. Of the first 67,000 mortgages insured under the GI Bill in the New York and northern New Jersey suburbs, fewer than 100 went to non-white veterans. And the income door third. Rankin's local administration worked exactly the way he built it to. Southern employment offices routinely disqualified black veterans from the 5220 benefit by referring them to available agricultural or domestic work, at wages far below the $20, which was the entire point. Roughly 350,000 women served in uniform, and they hit their own version of it. The benefits were technically theirs, but discharge policy pushed them out early. University admissions applied hard quotas to women in professional programs, and the home loan benefit ran through banks that would not treat a woman as a head of household on her own signature. Now put it together and say it flatly, because it doesn't need decoration. Home equity is the primary way American families move wealth from one generation to the next. The GI Bill triggered the largest single expansion of home equity in American history, and a generation was locked out of it at the exact moment the door stood open widest, not by an accident of implementation, but by a design choice made in a conference committee. That is not a metaphor for the modern racial wealth gap. It is a substantial part of its cause. And then the promise did what promises in this story always do. It got renegotiated downward. The Korea-era and Vietnam-era bills kept the name and changed the structure. Instead of paying tuition directly to the school, they paid the veteran a flat monthly check. That sounds like freedom. What it actually meant was that tuition inflation ate the benefit alive. The check stayed roughly flat while college costs took off. Same name, a fraction of the value. In 1984 came the Montgomery GY Bill, and with it a reversal so quiet that most people who paid it never noticed what it was. To be eligible, the service member now had to pay in Chausa $100 a month for the first 12 months of service, non-refundable, and if you never used the benefit, you never got it back. Read that again. The benefit had become a purchase. The post-9/11 GY Bill in 2008 restored most of what had been lost. Full in-state public tuition, a housing allowance, the ability to transfer unused benefits to a spouse or child. It was a genuine act of repair, and within about a year the extraction started. There was a rule requiring for-profit colleges to draw at least 10% of revenue from sources other than federal student aid, but GY Bill money was classified by the letter of the rule as non-federal, which meant a veteran wasn't just worth his own tuition to a for-profit school. Every GI Bill dollar he brought unlocked $9 more of federal student aid the school could collect from everybody else. Veterans became the single most valuable recruit in American higher education, and the industry went after them accordingly. Recruiters worked wounded warrior wards. Corinthian colleges collapsed. ITT Tech collapsed. Thousands of veterans were left holding credits from institutions that no longer existed and that no real university would accept, with their one-time benefit spent. The loophole was finally closed in 2021. It took 13 years, same pattern as always. A promise made in a moment of national conscience, then quietly monetized by whoever worked out where the money was pooling. So here's what this story is actually about underneath the dates. It's about who a country decides it owes, and how fast that debt gets renegotiated once the parade is over. Land warrants nobody could claim, $60 and a train ticket. An IOU dated 21 years out, tanks on Pennsylvania Avenue and a camp burning across the river from the Capitol. A man alone in a hotel room with a pencil, a congressman found in the dark in South Georgia and put on a plane. And a door built for 16 million people with the keys handed to the county. The Anacostia Flats are a park now. There's nothing there to tell you what happened. And the fear that drove those men to camp in the mud. The fear of being used up by your country and then handed a number that doesn't cover a life. That fear didn't end in 1944. It just changed its paperwork. It's a disability claim that's been pending for 14 months. It's 60 credit hours from a school that doesn't exist anymore. It's the 2.4 million homes that built a middle class, and the families who stood on their porches and watched the moving trucks go past their block toward a subdivision they weren't allowed to buy into. The GI Bill is the best thing this country ever did for its own people. And it was rationed. Both of those things are true at the same time, and any version of the story that gives you only one of them is selling you something. And it exists at all because one lawyer sat down in a hotel room with a pencil, and because a congressman from Georgia got found in the dark and put on a plane and walked into a room at 6:37 in the morning. That's how close it came. That is how thin the line is between a country that owes you something and a country that hands you $60 and a train ticket and tells you the rest is up to you. If this changed the way you think about what the country owes the people who serve it, subscribe. We go deep on the stories underneath the ones everybody knows, how the money actually moved, and who ended up holding it.